A hand pressed flat against a rusted door that wouldn't budge. She threw her shoulder into it. Nothing. The wood had swollen shut, sealed by years that nobody counted. She tried the handle, then tried again. Still nothing. But something was wrong. Margaret Thornton stepped back and looked closer. The hinges weren't rusted. They were welded. Someone had taken a torch to this door and sealed it from the inside, deliberately, permanently, as if whatever was behind it needed protecting from the outside world. She was 71 years old. She had driven 4 hours in a car she hadn't serviced in 2. And she was standing outside something a dead woman had left her for reasons she couldn't begin to explain. The building rose 6 stories above her, brick gone dark with age. The windows on the upper floors were clouded with decades of grime. But through the haze of the 4th floor, she thought she saw movement. A shadow passing. Then nothing. She looked down at the key in her hand. It didn't matter now. The lock it was cut for had been made useless by someone who didn't want this door opened. The question was why. Margaret hadn't been to Harwick in 43 years. Not since a cousin's wedding or maybe a funeral. She couldn't be sure anymore. Both events had blurred together in the way old memories do when you stop tending them, when you let the photographs yellow in their albums and the names fade from the backs of the prints. She'd driven up that morning from Millbrook, Ohio. 4 hours on the highway with the radio tuned to a station that played old country songs she didn't particularly like but didn't bother changing. That was the kind of thing she'd started noticing about herself lately. That she made less effort. That she let whatever was on stay on. That the world moved around her, and she just watched it pass, like scenery through a window she'd stopped looking through years ago. Her husband, Walter, had died 9 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. Quick and terrible. Her daughter, Catherine, had flown in from Edinburgh, where she'd married a professor, and built a life that seemed impossibly far away. Her son, Michael, had come from Phoenix Tan, and worried and completely helpless in the face of something that couldn't be fixed with money or optimism. They'd all held hands in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and grief. And then the room had emptied, and Margaret had gone home to an apartment that suddenly had too much furniture for one person. She'd adjusted. That was what you did. You moved the reading chair to the window, the one that faced west. You donated Walter's clothes to the church, keeping only his gray cardigan, because it still smelled like him and you couldn't bear to let that go. You planted tomatoes in the shared garden plot with Phyllis next door. You walked to the library on Tuesdays and checked out more books than you could read in a month, because the act of checking them out made the week feel organized. You called your children and they called back, and everyone said, "I love you" at the end and meant every word. And still, the weeks stretched out longer than they used to. The mornings came slower. The silence in the apartment grew louder until it became a sound of its own, a ringing absence that followed her from room to room. She hadn't told anyone. Not Michael, not Catherine, not Phyllis with her endless casseroles and her well-meaning invitations to book club. She hadn't told them that she'd been feeling small, that the routine she'd built so carefully had started to feel like something narrowing rather than something holding, that she woke up some mornings and couldn't remember why she was supposed to get out of bed. Beyond the fact that staying in it would make her feel worse. She wasn't the type to say things like that. Walter used to say she kept things in like a locked filing cabinet. He said it with affection, like it was something he'd learned to love about her. She'd pretended to be annoyed. Now she wished she'd told him more. Now she wished she'd told him everything. But that was the thing about grief. It didn't teach you lessons you could use. It just showed you all the ways you'd failed too late to fix any of them. So when a lawyer named Thomas Hartley called in March and said that a woman named Vera Thornton had passed away in February and left Margaret a building in Harwick, Margaret had written down the address, thanked Mr. Hartley for his time, and spent 2 days pretending she wasn't going to go. She didn't remember Vera well. Second cousin, maybe, or once removed. The kind of relative who existed at the edges of family functions, a face in a photograph, a name on a Christmas card that stopped coming sometime in the 90s. Margaret remembered her mother mentioning Vera occasionally, always with a particular tone. Something between sympathy and wariness. There'd been tragedy in Vera's life, something about a daughter, but Margaret had been young then, too caught up in her own world to pay attention to stories about relatives she barely knew. She hadn't reached out when the cards stopped coming. She didn't know why. She just hadn't. Life had gotten busy, and then it had gotten quiet. And either way, there never seemed to be a right moment to reconnect with someone you'd never really connected with in the first place. Mr. Hartley had been clear about the situation. The building had debts. Not ruinous ones, but real. Property taxes owed maintenance deferred the slow accumulation of costs that came with owning something you couldn't properly care for. It hadn't generated rental income in years. And a developer named Garrett Holcomb, prominent locally Mr. Hartley, had said with a tone that meant something had already submitted an offer. Enough to clear the debts and leave Margaret with something reasonable. Something quiet and practical. She'd asked how much time she had to decide. 60 days, he'd said. But frankly, the sooner the better, given the carrying costs. She'd thanked him again and hung up and stood in her kitchen looking at the address she'd written on the notepad by the phone. Harwick. The Harwick Arms. 6 floors. Built in 1924. 4 hours away. She could be there and back in a day if she pushed it. Sign whatever needed signing. Let the lawyer and the developer handle the rest. Collect her reasonable sum and go back to her library Tuesdays and her garden plot and her ringing silence. That was the practical choice. But something about the way Mr. Hartley had said Vera's name, something about the fact that Vera had chosen her out of everyone, out of all the distant relatives who must have existed, had chosen Margaret specifically. She didn't sleep well that night. In the morning, she packed a bag with enough clothes for 4 days and got in her car and drove east towards something she didn't understand. The hardware store was 3 blocks from the building, a small independent place with creaking floors, and an owner who looked like he'd been standing behind that counter since the Eisenhower administration. She'd asked for tools, something that could get through a welded door. He'd looked at her. 71 years old, gray hair pinned back, wearing the kind of practical clothes you wore when you expected to get dirty. She could see him calculating, trying to figure out what a woman her age wanted with a hacksaw and a crowbar. She didn't explain. She just waited. He'd sold her what she needed and thrown in a flashlight for free, just in case, he'd said. That building's been dark a long time. She'd thanked him and walked back to the Harwick Arms with her purchases in a paper bag, feeling like a burglar about to break into her own property. The welding wasn't as solid as it had looked. Whoever had done it had been thorough, but not professional. It took her 20 minutes and most of her strength to pry the door open enough to squeeze through. She stood in the darkness of the entrance for a moment, breathing hard, her shoulders aching from the effort. Then she turned on the flashlight and looked around. The lobby smelled like old wood and something else underneath. Something organic and warm like bread baking or laundry drying. It didn't make sense. The building was supposed to be abandoned. The linoleum floor was worn dark in the center where decades of feet had polished it smooth. Dust floated in the beam of her flashlight, suspended like something alive. The walls had been grand once. She could see traces of wallpaper beneath the grime, a pattern of vines and flowers that had probably been beautiful in 1924. The mailboxes were on the wall to her right. Old brass-face boxes scratched cloudy with age. Most of them were unmarked, but 3 of them had labels. Handwritten, recent ink, not faded at all. Unit 2 A. Brennan. Unit 3 B. Kowalski. Unit 4 A. Ashford. Margaret stared at those labels for a long moment. The building was supposed to be empty. Mr. Hartley had said it hadn't generated rental income in years. He'd said it was sitting unused, accumulating debts, waiting for someone to decide what to do with it. He hadn't mentioned tenants. He hadn't mentioned that anyone was living here at all. From somewhere above her, from a floor she couldn't see muffled by concrete, and years she heard music. A record player, something slow and old and unmistakably jazz. The kind of jazz that had been played in clubs that no longer existed in cities that had transformed into something unrecognizable. She looked at the stairs. She had driven 4 hours to sign papers and go home. She had a motel booked 6 blocks away, 4 nights plenty of time to handle whatever legal formalities were required. This wasn't supposed to be complicated. But those names on the mailboxes, that music drifting down from above. Someone had sealed this door to keep people out. And someone else was living here anyway. Margaret picked up her bag and started climbing. The second floor smelled like butter and brown sugar. She stopped on the landing and stood there, the scent washing over her. It was so unexpected, so completely at odds with everything she'd assumed about this place that, for a moment, she didn't move. A thin line of warm light showed under the door of Unit 2A. The heat was coming from there, too. A gentle warmth that felt like stepping into someone's kitchen on a winter morning. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again, harder. The sounds from inside stopped completely. A beat of silence. Then a voice, tight and careful. Building's closed. I'm aware, Margaret said. I own it. Another beat. Longer this time. She could feel someone on the other side of the door, calculating, deciding. Then the door opened 2 inches held by a chain. A girl looked at her through the gap. 16, maybe 17. Hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, flower on both forearms. Eyes that were assessing Margaret the same way Margaret was assessing her. You're the owner. It wasn't a question. I am. The chain came off. The door opened. Margaret stepped into what had once been a standard apartment kitchen and was now clearly a working bakery. Sheet pans covered every surface. Cooling racks lined the counters. A commercial-sized mixer that had no business being in a residential kitchen hummed quietly in the corner. The smell was overwhelming in the best way. Bread. sweet bread with fruit folded into it, cinnamon, vanilla, brown butter. The girl stood with her arms crossed, chin lifted like she was bracing for a fight. "Ruthie," she said. "Ruthie Brennan. Margaret. I know who you are. Vera told me you'd come." That stopped Margaret cold. Vera knew I'd come. She said you would. Eventually. She said I should trust you when you did. Margaret looked around the kitchen. Paper bags stacked by the door, each one with a small handwritten label. Names, apartment numbers, addresses she didn't recognize. "You're baking for the building, and a few places nearby. Farmer's market on Saturdays." Ruthie uncrossed her arms, but only slightly. I paid Vera $40 a month. I know the kitchen isn't licensed, but I'm not hurting anyone. I've been here 8 months." The defiance in her voice had shifted slightly towards something younger, something more vulnerable. "I'm not going back where I came from." Margaret heard what was underneath those words. The fear, the determination, the particular edge that came from someone who had left a bad situation and built something fragile and precious in its place. She'd been a bookkeeper for 30 years. She knew how to read people even if she wasn't always good at talking to them. "Does the oven work?" The girl blinked, surprised by the question. "Like a dream. I can smell that." Margaret picked up one of the paper bags, looking at Ruthie for permission. The girl nodded. Inside was a roll, dense and warm and soft in the center with a faint sweetness she couldn't immediately identify. Honey, maybe. Or apple butter. She ate half of it standing there and didn't say a word, because she was too busy tasting something made with real care. The kind of care that couldn't be faked, that came from someone who had found something worth doing and poured everything into it. "The other floors," Margaret said finally. "Are they occupied too?" Ruthie almost smiled. "You should see for yourself." The Kowalski family had Unit 3B. What they had done with it was astonishing. The apartment was small by any standard, a 2-bedroom built for a single person or a couple, not a family. But they had transformed it into a home. Real photographs on the walls, not in frames, but taped directly to the plaster. A collage of faces and moments that told the story of a family's history. A crucifix above the door, polished and cared for. 4 children arranged by size on a sofa that had seen better years but was clearly well loved. The father was a compact man with hands that told the story of his life. Calluses from tools, scars from work. He shook Margaret's hand and met her eyes directly the way men did when they wanted you to know they had nothing to hide. Hank Kowalski. Margaret Thornton. I own the building. Something flickered across his face. Wariness, maybe. Or acceptance of something he'd been expecting. His wife appeared from the tiny kitchen with 2 cups of tea before Margaret had said 10 words. Jolene. Blonde hair going gray, a face that had been beautiful once and had become something better with age, something warm and lived in. "We've been here 2 years, Hank said. He sat down across from Margaret and wrapped his hands around his own cup of tea. "Vera let us stay. We paid what we could when we could." Margaret drank her tea. It was good. Strong and hot, and exactly what she needed. "How did you find this place?" Hank and Jolene exchanged a look. The kind of look married couples develop over years, a whole conversation in a single glance. "We were in trouble," Jolene said. Her voice was quiet but steady. "The kids' paperwork. Our paperwork. It's complicated. We came here legally," Hank added quickly. "But the system, it doesn't always work the way it's supposed to. We fell through the cracks. Couldn't get what we needed to stay official." Margaret nodded slowly. She didn't need the details. She understood enough. "Vera helped you." "Vera didn't ask questions," Hank said. "She just saw that we needed somewhere to be, and she gave us somewhere to be." He paused, looking around the small apartment. "I've been doing what I can, keeping the boiler running, fixing what breaks. Not because anyone asked me to, because it's the right thing to do. Because this place gave us something when we had nothing, and a man pays his debts." Margaret looked at the photographs on the wall. One of them showed a farmhouse somewhere green and far from here. Poland, maybe. A place they couldn't go back to. She looked at the 4 children on the sofa, watching her with curious, careful eyes. She looked at Hank and Jolene, waiting for her judgment. "3 winters," she said. Hank nodded. "The boiler's old, temperamental, but I know how to talk to it." Margaret finished her tea and stood up. "Thank you for the tea." That was all she said, but something in the way she said it made Jolene's shoulders relax, made Hank's grip on his cup loosen just slightly. She wasn't here to throw them out. They could see that now. She wasn't sure what she was here to do, but it wasn't that. The 4th floor had a different kind of quiet. The music she'd heard from the lobby was louder now, clearer. A piano, a bass, a voice that had been recorded decades ago, scratchy with age, but still alive with something that made her slow her steps on the stairs. Unit 4A had a door slightly ajar. She knocked and it swung open. Inside was a man of about 80, sitting in a chair by the window with a record player beside him and a stack of albums at his feet. He was watching the street below his hands, resting on his knees, perfectly still. He didn't turn when she entered. "Mr. Ashford." Nothing. Not a word. Not a movement. Just the music playing and the old man sitting and the light coming through the dirty window like something trying to break through. Margaret stood there for a moment unsure. Then she saw the second chair. It was positioned next to his angle toward the same window as if he'd been expecting someone to sit there. As if the chair had been waiting like everything else in this building for someone to arrive. She sat down. They watched the street together. She didn't know what she was looking for. Neither she suspected did he. The record finished. The needle hit the inner groove and a soft, repeated tick-tick-tick filled the room. She got up and lifted the needle. She looked through his albums, Miles Davis, Coltrane, Ahmad Jamal, names she recognized from Walter's collection records she hadn't listened to since he died because they reminded her too much of Sunday afternoons and the way he used to close his eyes when the music got to the good part. She put on another one, something slower, a piano piece that sounded like rain falling in an empty room. When she sat back down, something in Clyde Ashford's posture had loosened. Just slightly. Just enough. Ruthie had told her about him before she climbed to the 4th floor. His name was Clyde Ashford. He'd been a real jazz musician once, back when that meant something. Clubs in New York, a few recorded tracks, a name that people used to know. He'd stopped playing 2 years ago, the same time he'd stopped speaking. Ruthie wasn't sure what had happened. She thought it might be grief. She thought maybe it was something medical, something that had broken inside him. He'd come to Harwick 5 years ago, found Vera somehow moved into the 4th floor, and started filling it with music. Then the music had stopped. Now he just sat by the window and listened to other people play. Other people who had found what they wanted to say and said it while he kept his silence like a secret he couldn't share. Margaret sat with him until the album finished. Then she got up, touched his shoulder gently, and left. She'd climbed one more flight of stairs before she realized she hadn't said a word to him the entire time. Neither had he. And somehow that had been exactly right. The 5th floor belonged to Eugene Mercer. His door was closed and locked. A small handmade sign was taped to the wood. Do not disturb. Research in progress. She knocked twice and was turning to leave when the door opened and a man in his mid-60s looked at her from behind glasses that needed cleaning. He was holding a stack of papers against his chest like armor. He had the look of someone who had recently been important and was still deciding what he was now. "I know why you're here," he said before she could speak. "I'm not sure you do." "You're going to sell to Holcomb." The name landed flat. She didn't react because she didn't yet know that she should. "I'm here to look at the property." She kept her voice careful, measured. "I haven't decided anything." He studied her for a long moment. His eyes were sharp behind those dirty glasses. Sharp and searching like he was looking for something specific and wasn't sure if he'd found it. Then he stepped aside. "Come in. There are things you should see." The apartment was a collapsed archive. Boxes everywhere. Document boxes, file folders, accordion files, loose stacks held together with rubber bands. The whole place looked like a library that had given up on organization, like someone had been collecting information for years and had never figured out where to put it. Margaret stood in this doorway and stared. What is all of this evidence? The word hung in the air. Eugene Mercer moved through the chaos with the familiarity of someone who knew exactly where everything was, even if no one else could make sense of it. "I was a city archivist for 15 years, he said. He set his stack of papers down on a table that was already covered with stacks of papers, responsible for land records, property filings, historical documents, the kind of paperwork that tells the real story of who owned what and when. What happened?" He smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I was dismissed 2 years ago. Officially for misappropriation of resources." He made air quotes with his fingers. "What that means is I took copies of documents I shouldn't have taken, and I refused to destroy them when my supervisor asked me to." "Why would your supervisor want documents destroyed?" Eugene looked at her over his glasses. "That's the question, isn't it?" He moved to one of the stacks and pulled out a folder. "Vera gave me this apartment because she needed somewhere safe for all of this. She needed someone who understood what it meant." He opened the folder and started spreading papers on the table. "And she left you the building because she needed someone who couldn't be bought." Margaret looked at the documents. dates going back to the 1970s, company names she didn't recognize, property transfers and permit applications, and official seals that had yellowed with age. She was a bookkeeper for 30 years. She knew what financial paperwork looked like when someone was trying to hide something. "These are shell companies," she said. Eugene's eyebrows rose. "You can read this. I spent 3 decades reading things like this. Different contexts, but the patterns are the same." She pointed to a signature on one document, then found the same signature on another, dated 12 years later. Same signatory, different company name. "That's not a coincidence." "No," Eugene said slowly. "It isn't." He looked at her with something like respect. "Vera was right about you." But he didn't show her everything. That was what surprised her. She'd expected him to lay it all out, to explain the whole conspiracy in detail, to hand her the story like a gift. Instead, he showed her fragments, pieces of a puzzle without the picture on the box. "Vera wanted you to find this yourself," he said when she pressed him. "She left clues. In her apartment. In the building. She wanted you to look for them. Why? Because she needed to know you cared enough to look." He paused, taking off his glasses and cleaning them on his shirt. "She spent 50 years waiting for someone to finish what her daughter started. She needed to know you were the right person, not just someone who showed up, someone who chose to stay." Margaret felt something shift inside her. A door opening, a question being asked that she hadn't known she needed to answer. Her daughter Eugene put his glasses back on. Dorothy Thornton. She was 23 years old in 1975. She worked as a file clerk for a city contractor. And she found something in those files that someone didn't want found. What happened to her? She disappeared. June of 1975. The official story is that she ran away with a boyfriend. Closed case. Margaret's voice was quiet. But that's not what happened. Eugene didn't answer directly. "Vera's apartment is on the 6th floor. She left something there for you. A box. She told me about it before she died." He looked at Margaret with those sharp, searching eyes. "She said you'd know what to do with it when you were ready." Margaret found the box in Vera's apartment. It was sitting on the kitchen table like Vera had put it there just before she died, and had been waiting ever since. A wooden box, old and well made, with a small brass lock. Carved into the lid in careful letters for the one who finds this. "Only open when you have met everyone who lives here." Margaret sat down at the table and looked at the box. She had met them. Ruthie, with her flower-covered arms and her secret bakery. Hank and Jolene and their 4 children living on the grace of a stranger, and paying it back with 3 winters of keeping the building warm. Clyde Ashford, who had stopped speaking and stopped playing, and now just listened to what he'd lost. Eugene Mercer, surrounded by the paper trail of someone else's sins. They were all here because Vera had let them be here. They were all waiting to see what Margaret would do. She opened the box. Inside, she found 3 things. A photograph of a young woman with dark hair and a determined face. Dorothy Thornton. 22 years old in what looked like an employee ID photo, looking directly at the camera with the kind of expression that suggested she wasn't going to look away from anything. A journal old and water-stained, filled with Vera's handwriting. Decades of notes, observations, suspicions, and a small key, brass unmarked. Too small for a door, too big for a jewelry box. Margaret picked up the photograph first. Dorothy looked a little like Vera. Something in the shape of her face, the set of her jaw. But there was something else there, too. Something that made Margaret pause. The line of her jaw. The way she held her chin. It looked like Margaret's own reflection, 50 years ago. She set the photograph down and opened the journal. The first entry was dated June 19th, 1975. The day Dorothy had disappeared. "My daughter came to me this morning," Vera had written. "She said she'd found something terrible. She said she had to tell someone. She said she was going to do the right thing, no matter what it cost. I told her to be careful. She smiled at me and said, 'Mama, I've been careful my whole life. Sometimes being careful isn't enough.' That was the last time I saw her." Margaret read for an hour. The journal told the story in fragments. Vera's search for answers, her growing certainty that Dorothy hadn't run away, that something had been done to her. Her discovery of the documents her daughter had been investigating. Her realization that the web of corruption went deeper than anyone had imagined. And one name that appeared again and again. Holcomb. Not Garrett Holcomb. His father. Warren Holcomb. A detective with the Harwick Police Department. The detective assigned to investigate Dorothy's disappearance. The same detective who had closed the case after 3 months, ruling it a voluntary disappearance. Margaret set the journal down. The developer who wanted to buy this building was the son of the man who had covered up Dorothy's disappearance. Vera had known that. Vera had been waiting for someone to finish what her daughter had started. And she had chosen Margaret. Margaret sat in Vera's apartment until the light through the windows turned orange, and then purple, and then dark. She thought about the building beneath her. 6 floors of secrets and survivors. People who had found shelter here because one old woman had decided that some things mattered more than money. She thought about the developer who would come, who had probably already been calling, who would offer her a reasonable sum to walk away from all of this. She thought about Dorothy Thornton, 23 years old, trying to do the right thing. She thought about herself, 71 years old, driving 4 hours to sign papers and go home. She picked up the small brass key. She didn't know what it opened yet, but she was going to find out. That night she went to the motel she'd booked. 4 nights. Plenty of time to handle the legal formalities. But she didn't sleep. She lay in the dark and thought about Walter. About the way he used to say she kept things in like a locked filing cabinet. About the 9 years since he'd died, the way she'd made herself smaller and smaller until she barely took up any space at all. She thought about what Eugene had said. Vera left you the building because she needed someone who couldn't be bought. She didn't know if that was true. She didn't know if she was strong enough or brave enough or stubborn enough to be what Vera needed. But she knew one thing. She wasn't going to sign those papers tomorrow. She wasn't going to hand this building over to the son of the man who had destroyed Dorothy Thornton. Not yet. Not until she understood what she was holding. In the morning, her phone rang. The voice on the other end was smooth and unhurried. It introduced itself as Garrett Holcomb. He said he wanted to reach out personally. He felt it was important. He was in Harwick today. He'd like to meet. Margaret looked at herself in the motel bathroom mirror. 71 years old. Gray hair that needed brushing. Eyes that hadn't slept enough. She thought about saying no. She thought about saying she needed more time. Instead, she said, 10 o'clock. I'll be at the building. He arrived at 9:45. That told her something right away. Garrett Holcomb was tall and silver-haired, and the kind of well-dressed that didn't announce itself. He wore his success like a comfortable coat, something he'd had so long he'd forgotten it was there. He shook her hand on the sidewalk outside the Harwick Arms and smiled in a way that had been practiced for a very long time. Mrs. Thornton, I appreciate you seeing me. Miss, she said, and I haven't agreed to anything yet. Of course. He turned to look at the building's facade as if admiring it. It's a beautiful building. You can see what it was. I can. I want to be straightforward with you. He paused, and she recognized the pause. It was the kind of pause that came before a rehearsed speech. The kind of pause that was meant to make the words that followed seem spontaneous. I'm planning something significant for this block. Residential mixed use, the kind of development that lifts the whole neighborhood. This building is the center of that plan. And I want to give you a fair price. Mr. Hartley mentioned a number. I'm prepared to go higher. Another pause. Longer this time. I understand you've been inside. I understand you may have encountered certain situations. People in the building. Margaret's face didn't change. I have. Those situations are not your responsibility. He said it like he was offering her a gift, an absolution. I have experience relocating people in sensitive circumstances. Properly. With resources. She heard what he wasn't saying. He knew about the Kowalskis. About Ruthie. About everyone who had made this building their home. He knew, and he was offering to make them disappear. The building has structural issues, he continued. You may not be aware of their severity. This could become a liability. He said the word liability slowly. He wanted her to hear it and feel afraid of it. Margaret looked at him. She thought about the boiler that Hank Kowalski had kept running for 3 winters. She thought about the bread that Ruthie Brennan baked every morning. She thought about Clyde Ashford sitting by his window listening to music, waiting for something that might never come. She thought about Dorothy Thornton. I'll need a few more days, she said. Garrett Holcomb's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Something cold flickered in his eyes just for a moment before the practiced warmth returned. Of course, take your time. He handed her a card. My direct line. When you're ready. He left. Margaret stood on the sidewalk and watched him go. She thought about the phrase relocating people in sensitive circumstances. She thought about what that meant for Hank and Jolene and their 4 children. She thought about Vera Thornton waiting 50 years for someone to finish what Dorothy had started. Then she went back inside the building and climbed the stairs to the 6th floor. She had a journal to finish reading. She had a key to find a lock for. And she had a decision to make that would change everything. The sun was setting by the time she finished reading Vera's journal. The whole story was there in fragments and suspicions and carefully documented evidence. 50 years of one woman's search for the truth about her daughter. And at the center of it all, a building. This building. The Harwick Arms had been part of the original scheme. One of dozens of properties shuffled through shell companies bought and sold at prices that made no sense unless you understood what was really being exchanged. Dorothy had figured it out. Dorothy had tried to stop it. Dorothy had disappeared. And now Margaret was standing in the same place, holding the same truth, facing the same choice. She could walk away. Take the money. Go back to Ohio and her silent apartment and her library Tuesdays and her slow, quiet, narrowing life. Or she could stay. She could find out what the key opened. She could finish what Dorothy had started. Margaret looked out the window at the city below. The lights were coming on one by one like stars appearing in a darkening sky. She was 71 years old. She had driven 4 hours to sign papers and go home. But Vera had known something about her, had seen something in her that Margaret hadn't seen in herself. Someone who couldn't be bought. Someone who would care enough to look. Someone who would choose to stay. Margaret picked up the brass key and held it in her palm. She didn't know what it opened, but she was going to find out. The journal told her where to look. Margaret sat in Vera's apartment as the morning light crept through the windows, reading the same pages again and again, until the words stopped being words and became something else. A map. A guide. A voice reaching across 50 years of silence. Vera had been meticulous. Every suspicion documented. Every connection traced. Every dead end noted and revisited. But she had also been afraid. The entries from the early years were bold, angry, desperate. A mother searching for her daughter, refusing to accept the official story, demanding answers that no one wanted to give. Then, something changed. Around 1982, the entries became shorter, more cautious. Vera stopped naming names directly and started using initials. She stopped keeping the journal in her apartment and started hiding it in different locations throughout the building. Someone had threatened her. Margaret could read it between the lines in the spaces where Vera had chosen not to write. Someone had made it clear that her search was not welcome, that continuing would have consequences. But Vera hadn't stopped. She had just learned to be invisible. The key was the first puzzle. Margaret turned it over in her hand, feeling its weight. Brass, old, slightly tarnished. Too small for any door she had seen in the building. Too large for a jewelry box or a diary lock. Vera's journal mentioned it only once in an entry from 2015. I have hidden the last piece where Dorothy left it, where she always felt safe. Where the music lives. The key will find its home when the time is right. Where the music lives. Margaret thought about the 4th floor. About Clyde Ashford and his record collection and his silence. About the piano she had glimpsed against the far wall covered with a cloth so thick with dust that she had taken it for furniture. She put the key in her pocket and went downstairs. Clyde was in his usual chair by the window. The record player was silent today. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, watching the street below with the patience of someone who had learned that waiting was its own kind of action. Margaret didn't speak. She had learned in her visits over the past few days that Clyde didn't respond well to questions. He didn't respond to anything, really. He just existed in his silence, listening to whatever played inside his head. But he noticed her. She could tell by the way his shoulders shifted when she entered the room, the way his hands tightened slightly, then relaxed. He knew she was there. She crossed to the piano. The cloth was heavy velvet once, but now just thick with years. She pulled it off slowly, revealing the instrument beneath. An upright, old but well made. The wood was dark with age, and the keys had yellowed to the color of old teeth. But it wasn't abandoned. Someone had cared for this piano. The keys were clean. The wood had been polished, maybe not recently, but within the past few years. This wasn't a forgotten piece of furniture. This was something that mattered. Margaret ran her fingers over the keys without pressing them. Then she saw the lock. A small brass fitting on the side of the piano where the top met the body. Not a standard feature. Something that had been added later, carefully, deliberately. She took out the key. It fit perfectly. The lid opened to reveal a compartment that hadn't been part of the original design. Someone had modified this piano, hollowed out a space inside it, created a hiding place that would survive any casual inspection. Inside the compartment was a manila envelope yellowed with age. Margaret's hands were steady as she took it out. She was aware of Clyde watching her now, not just tolerating her presence, but actually watching his head turn slightly. His eyes focused on what she was doing. She opened the envelope. Inside were documents. Original documents, not copies. Property transfers, permit applications, financial statements. The same kind of paperwork Eugene had shown her, but older, dating back to 1974 and 75. And beneath the documents, a letter, handwritten, folded once. The paper was brittle with age, but the ink was still clear. Margaret unfolded it and began to read. To whoever finds this, my name is Dorothy Thornton. I am 23 years old. I work as a file clerk for Mercer and Associates, a contractor that handles development projects for the city of Harwick. If you are reading this letter, it means I did not come back. I have discovered something that powerful people want kept hidden. A network of shell companies used to manipulate property values and defraud the city. Money changing hands that should not change hands. Permits approved that should not be approved. Land taken from people who did not want to sell. At the center of this network is a family named Holcomb. I have made copies of the evidence. I have hidden them in different places. I've told my mother where to look if something happens to me. I'm going to give this information to a reporter tomorrow morning. I'm going to do what is right, no matter what it costs. But I'm afraid. So I'm leaving this letter here in the one place where I have always felt safe. Mr. Ashford lets me listen to him play. He says the music tells the truth even when words can't. If you are reading this, please do not let my story end here. Please do not let them win. Finish what I started. Dorothy Thornton, June 18th, 1975. Margaret read the letter 3 times. She read it until her eyes burned and her chest ached, and the words blurred together into something that felt less like information and more like a wound. Dorothy had been 23 years old. She had discovered something terrible. She had tried to do the right thing, and she had disappeared the day before she could tell anyone. June 19th, 1975. 50 years ago. Margaret looked at Clyde. He was watching her with something she hadn't seen in his face before. Recognition, maybe. Or relief. "You knew her," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. Clyde didn't speak. But he nodded. A single, slow movement. "You kept this safe. All these years. You waited." Another nod. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. His silence had become so complete, so total, that the idea of him breaking it seemed impossible. Then he spoke. His voice was rusty rough, like something that had been locked away for so long it had almost forgotten how to work. Who would believe me 3 words? But they carried the weight of 50 years. A black jazz musician in 1975, accusing a white police detective of covering up a young woman's disappearance, claiming to have evidence hidden in a piano. Who would have believed him? Who would have listened? Margaret sat down heavily on the piano bench. She understood now. She understood why Vera had left this building to her specifically. Why she had insisted that Margaret find the clues herself. Why she had needed someone from outside Harwick, someone with no connections to the power structures that had protected the Holcombs for half a century. She needed someone who would care enough to look. Someone who had nothing to lose. Someone who was too old and too tired and too far from home to be afraid. Margaret looked at the letter in her hands. Dorothy had asked her to finish what she started. Vera had spent 50 years waiting for someone to answer that request. And now Margaret was here, 71 years old, holding evidence that could destroy a powerful family. She didn't know if she was brave enough, but she was gonna try. She took the documents to Eugene. He spread them across his table, his hands trembling slightly as he recognized what he was looking at. "These are originals," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Dorothy's originals. The ones everyone thought were lost. They were in the piano." Eugene looked up at her. "Clyde had them." Margaret nodded. "He's been waiting 50 years for someone to come and find them." Eugene sat down heavily. "I've been working with copies of copies, some of them. Enough to see the pattern, but not enough to prove anything in court." He gestured at the documents. "But these are different. These are the foundation. What do we do with them?" Eugene was quiet for a long moment. "There's a journalist," he said finally, "Rachel Callahan. She's been investigating Garrett Holcomb for 2 years. He paused. "But she needs more than documents. She needs someone willing to go on record. A property owner. Someone with standing." "I'm the property owner." "Yes." Eugene met her eyes. "You are." Margaret called Brenda Callahan that afternoon. The journalist answered on the second ring, her voice sharp and professional. "Ms. Callahan, my name is Margaret Thornton. I own a building in Harwick called the Harwick Arms. I understand you've been investigating Garrett Holcomb." A pause. "Who gave you my number? A former city archivist named Eugene Mercer." Another pause. Longer this time. I know Eugene. He's been trying to get me to look at his documents for 2 years. I have more documents now. Originals. And I have a story that goes back to 1975. Margaret could hear the journalist's breathing change, the careful professional distance giving way to something else. What kind of story a young woman named Dorothy Thornton tried to expose the same corruption that you're investigating? She disappeared the day before she could go public. The detective who covered up her disappearance was Warren Holcomb. Silence. Garrett Holcomb's father. Yes. Margaret let that sit for a moment. I own the building? She continued. I have the evidence, and I'm willing to go on record. When can we meet? But Garrett Holcomb was not going to wait. The letter arrived the next morning. Someone had slipped it under the front door of the building during the night. No envelope. One page folded once. Margaret read it standing in the lobby, the morning light filtering through the dirty windows. Notice of emergency structural inspection. The building located at 414 Harwick Street has been flagged for immediate structural assessment pursuant to City Code Section 12.4.7. An inspection team will arrive Monday, March 23rd at 9 a.m. All occupants must vacate the premises during the inspection period. Failure to comply may result in citation and forced evacuation. The letterhead looked official. The language was bureaucratic. The signature was illegible. But the phone number at the bottom wasn't listed in any city directory, and the inspection date was 3 days away. Margaret showed the letter to Hank Kowalski. He read it slowly, his calloused fingers tracing the words. The building is fine, he said. He didn't look up from the paper. I've been through every inch of it. The bones are good. This isn't about the building. No. His voice was flat. It isn't. He finally looked at her, his eyes hard with something she recognized. Not fear. Something older than fear. This is how they work, he said. Create a violation. Force an evacuation. Once everyone's out, they find reasons to keep them out. He handed the letter back to her. I've seen it before. Different city, different country. Same story. Margaret folded the letter and put it in her pocket. We have 3 days, she said. What are you gonna do? She thought about Dorothy's letter, about Vera's journal, about 50 years of silence. I'm gonna make sure they don't get away with it again. That night, someone tried to break into the building. Margaret was in her apartment on the 3rd floor, the one she had started thinking of as hers, even though she had only been there a week. She had fallen asleep reading Vera's journal, the weight of 50 years of secrets pressing down on her. The sound woke her. Not loud, just wrong. A scrape of metal on metal. A footstep in a place where there shouldn't be footsteps. She lay very still in the darkness, listening. Voices, low and urgent, coming from above her. Eugene's apartment. Margaret got out of bed. She didn't turn on the light. She didn't reach for her phone to call for help. She reached for the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall by the door. It was heavy in her hands, solid, real. She was 71 years old. She had never been in a fight in her life. She had spent 9 years making herself smaller and quieter and less visible. But somewhere in this building, someone was threatening the people she had started to care about. And she was tired of being small. She climbed the stairs in the darkness. Eugene's door was open. She could see shadows moving inside. 2 figures, both larger than Eugene, going through his boxes with the quick efficiency of people who knew what they were looking for. Eugene was nowhere in sight. Margaret stepped into the doorway. "Get out." Her voice was steady. She didn't know where that came from. The 2 figures turned. She couldn't see their faces in the darkness, just shapes, just the suggestion of menace. One of them laughed. "Lady, you should go back to bed." He took a step toward her. Margaret swung the fire extinguisher. She didn't aim. She didn't think. She just swung with everything she had. 71 years of fear and grief and silence channeled into one desperate motion. The impact jarred her shoulders. The man went down. The second man lunged at her. She screamed. Not for help. Just a raw sound of fury that surprised her as much as it surprised him. Then footsteps thundered on the stairs, and Hank Kowalski was there, a length of iron pipe in his hands. His face set in an expression that promised violence. The second intruder took one look at him and ran. His partner scrambled to his feet and followed, clutching his shoulder where the fire extinguisher had connected. Margaret stood in the doorway, breathing hard, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped her weapon. Hank looked at her. "You all right?" She wasn't sure. "I think so." He nodded, once respect in his eyes. That was brave. That was stupid. He almost smiled. Sometimes those are the same thing. Eugene emerged from the back of his apartment where he had hidden when the intruders arrived. His glasses were askew. His hands were trembling. But he was alive. "They took a box," he said. His voice was hollow. "One of the boxes with original documents. The Holcomb files, some of them." He sat down heavily among his scattered papers. "They knew exactly what to look for. They knew where I kept them." Margaret felt cold. "Someone told them." "Yes." "Who?" Eugene shook his head. "I don't know. I've been careful. I thought I'd been careful." Margaret thought about the letter under the door. The inspection notice. The timing of everything. "They're scared," she said slowly. "They wouldn't be doing this if they weren't scared." Eugene looked up at her. "They should be scared." He paused. "Because I made copies. Everything that was in that box I photocopied years ago. The copies are in a safe deposit box in Cleveland." He almost smiled. Old habits. But the break-in had changed something. Margaret lay awake that night listening to the sounds of the building settling around her. The creak of old wood. The whisper of wind through gaps in the windows. The distant rumble of the boiler that Hank kept running. She thought about the man she had hit with the fire extinguisher. The weight of it in her hands. The way her shoulders had ached afterward. She thought about what might have happened if Hank hadn't come. She thought about Ruthie on the second floor, 17 years old and alone. About the Kowalski children sleeping in their beds while men broke into their building. About Dorothy Thornton, 23 years old, trying to do the right thing. She had been afraid to go to sleep. 50 years later, Margaret was afraid too, but fear wasn't going to stop her. The next morning, she went to see Clyde. He was in his usual chair, but something was different. The record player was on, but he wasn't listening to someone else. He was humming. A melody she didn't recognize, something slow and searching. The kind of tune that felt like it was trying to remember itself. Margaret sat down in the other chair. Dorothy's letter, she said. The documents she hid. They're the key to everything. Clyde stopped humming. I know. Why now? Why did you keep them hidden all these years? He was quiet for a long moment. When Dorothy disappeared, he said finally, I went to the police, told them she'd been scared, told them she'd been investigating something. His voice was stronger today, clearer, as if speaking to her had loosened something that had been locked tight. They laughed at me, said she'd run off with some boy, said I was just an old musician with an overactive imagination. He turned to look at her. Warren Holcomb came to see me a week later, told me to keep my mouth shut, told me what would happen if I didn't. What did he threaten everything? My career, my freedom. He paused. My life. So you stopped talking? Clyde nodded slowly. Seemed safer. Seemed like the only way to survive. But you kept the documents. I made her a promise. He looked out the window at the city below. I promised I would keep them safe until someone came who could use them. Someone who could finish what she started. His eyes found hers. You're the one. I knew it the first time you sat down in that chair. You've got the same look she had. What look? Like you've stopped being afraid of the wrong things. Brenda Callahan arrived on Saturday. She was 34 years old, with the particular focus of someone who had been waiting for this story her entire career. She wore her determination like armor, and she didn't waste time with pleasantries. She and Margaret sat at Eugene's table surrounded by documents. Show me everything, Brenda said. So Margaret did. 3 hours later, Brenda sat back in her chair and let out a long breath. This is it, she said. This is the story I've been trying to write for 2 years. You can prove it. I can prove enough of it. The pattern of shell companies, the permit irregularities, the connection between Warren Holcomb and the 1975 investigation. She paused. And now the connection to Garrett Holcomb's current development projects. What do you need from me? Brenda looked at her directly. I need you to go on record. I need your name attached to this. I need you to say publicly that you own this building and that you found evidence of corruption. Dating back 50 years, Margaret thought about what that would mean. The scrutiny, the attention, the retaliation. She thought about Garrett Holcomb's smooth voice on the phone, the inspection notice under her door, the men who had broken into Eugene's apartment. If I do this, she said slowly, they'll come after me. Yes. They'll try to destroy me. Probably. Margaret looked at the documents spread across the table. Dorothy's handwriting. Vera's meticulous notes. 50 years of secrets waiting to be told. She thought about Walter, about what he would say if he could see her now. She thought about her children, far away living their lives. about the woman she had been before grief had made her small. She thought about what it would mean to stop being small. "All right," she said. "I'll do it." The article would run on Thursday. That gave them 4 days. 4 days to prepare. 4 days to gather additional evidence. 4 days to wait for Holcomb to make his next move. He didn't disappoint. On Sunday morning, a man Margaret didn't recognize appeared at the building. He wore a city inspector's badge and carried a clipboard. "I'm here for the preliminary structural assessment," he said. Margaret met him at the door. "The inspection is scheduled for Monday. This is a preliminary visit. Standard procedure." He tried to step past her. She didn't move. "I'd like to see your identification," she said. "And I'd like to verify this visit with the city permits office." The man's smile flickered. "That won't be necessary." "I think it is." They stood there for a long moment. Two people who understood exactly what was happening. Then Hank appeared behind Margaret. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He just stood there, a solid presence, his work-worn hands at his sides. The inspector looked at Hank. He looked at Margaret. "I'll come back Monday," he said. "You do that." Margaret watched him walk away. Her hands were shaking again. But she didn't let him see. That night, Margaret sat with Clyde. She had started doing that more often. Sitting with him in the evening, listening to records, watching the city lights come on below. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them had become comfortable. Two people who understood that sometimes words weren't necessary. Tonight, though, she had something to say. "I'm going on record." The article runs Thursday. Clyde nodded slowly. "You know what that means," she said. "For everyone in this building, there will be attention, questions, maybe worse." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke. "I stopped talking because I thought silence would protect me. Thought if I just stayed quiet, stayed invisible, nothing could touch me." He turned to look at her. "But I was wrong. Silence doesn't protect you. It just makes you smaller. Until one day you wake up and realize you've disappeared." His eyes were bright with something she hadn't seen before. "You're not silent, you're not small, and you're not gonna disappear." Margaret felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "I'm 71 years old," she said. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this." Clyde almost smiled. Dorothy was 23. She wasn't strong enough either, but she did it anyway. He reached out and put his hand over hers. "Strength isn't about winning. It's about standing up." Monday morning arrived with gray skies and a cold wind. Margaret was waiting on the front steps of the building when Garrett Holcomb arrived. He came with an entourage this time. 2 lawyers in expensive suits. The same inspector from Sunday. 2 other men who weren't introduced, large and silent, positioned like furniture. And behind them, a man with a city badge who Margaret suspected was not actually from the city. Ms. Thornton. Holcomb's voice was still smooth, but there was an edge beneath it now. "I had hoped we could resolve this amicably." "So had I." He looked at the building behind her. "My inspectors need access. Any obstruction will be reported." Margaret didn't move. "I've spoken with the actual city permits office," she said. "There's no emergency inspection scheduled for this address." There never was. Holcomb's smile didn't waver. There seems to have been an administrative oversight. I'm sure it will be corrected. I'm sure it will. She paused. I've also spoken with a journalist named Brenda Callahan. She's been very interested in the administrative oversights in your development projects. Something flickered in Holcomb's eyes. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you that I know what your father did in 1975. I know what you're doing now. And I know that by Thursday everyone else will know too. The silence stretched between them. You're making a mistake, Holcomb said. His voice had dropped the smooth pretense. You don't understand what you're dealing with. I understand perfectly. Margaret met his eyes. I'm 71 years old, she said. I lost my husband 9 years ago. I spent all those years making myself smaller because I thought that was how you survived. She stepped forward. But I was wrong, and your father was wrong, and you are wrong. Her voice was steady now. You can threaten me. You can send your inspectors and your lawyers and your men in expensive suits. But you cannot make me disappear. She looked past him at the building, at the windows where Ruthie was watching, at the floor where Hank and Jolene stood with their children, at the fourth floor window where Clyde Ashford was finally, after 50 years, watching someone stand up. This building belongs to me, she said. These people are under my protection, and we are not going anywhere. Holcomb stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to his car. His entourage followed. Margaret stood on the steps until they were gone. Then her knees buckled and she had to catch herself on the railing. Ruthie was there in seconds, taking her arm. You were amazing, the girl said. I was terrified. Ruthie almost smiled. That's what made it amazing. That night, something changed. Margaret was in her apartment trying to read when she heard music from above. Not a record. A piano. She put down her book and climbed the stairs to the fourth floor. Clyde was sitting at the piano, his hands on the keys. He wasn't playing a complete piece, just fragments, phrases, notes that seemed to be searching for each other, trying to remember how they fit together. He stopped when he heard her. Not ready, he said. His voice was rough with emotion. Almost. But not ready. Margaret sat down in the chair by the window. Take your time. He looked at her. 50 years, he said. I waited 50 years. And now it's coming back. Slowly. But it's coming back. He put his hands on the keys again. She stayed to listen. The music was broken and beautiful, like something that had been shattered and was beginning to find its shape again. Like all of them, she thought. Like the building itself. Like everything that had been hidden in these walls for half a century. Coming back to life. The article was scheduled to publish at 6 in the morning on Thursday. Margaret didn't sleep Wednesday night. She sat in Vera's apartment on the 6th floor, surrounded by the documents that had taken 50 years to surface. Dorothy's letter was in her pocket, folded carefully, the paper soft from handling. She had read it so many times now that she could recite it from memory. Please do not let my story end here. Please do not let them win. Finish what I started. Through the window, she watched the city lights flicker and fade, as midnight passed and the early hours crept toward dawn. Somewhere below her, the building breathed with the lives it sheltered. Ruthie sleeping above her ovens, ready to wake at 4 to start the bread. Hank and Jolene and their children dreaming whatever immigrants dream when they have found a place to rest. Clyde Ashford, who had started playing again after 50 years of silence. Eugene Mercer, surrounded by his documents, probably not sleeping either. They were all waiting. They were all trusting her. At 5:45, her phone buzzed. A text from Brenda Callahan. It's live. The headline was simple and devastating. 50 years of secrets. How a Harwick development dynasty built its empire on corruption and cover-ups. Margaret read the article on her phone as the sun rose over the city. Brenda had been meticulous. Every claim sourced. Every document referenced. The story started in 1974 with the first shell company transactions and traced the pattern forward through 5 decades. And at the center of it all, 2 names. Warren Holcomb, detective, who had closed the investigation into Dorothy Thornton's disappearance after only 3 months. Garrett Holcomb, developer, who had continued his father's methods with the same properties, the same techniques, the same willingness to destroy anyone who got in his way. Margaret's name appeared twice, once as the current owner of the Harwick Arms, once in a quote she had given Brenda 3 days ago. My cousin Dorothy Thornton tried to do the right thing in 1975. She disappeared for it. I am finishing what she started. She read those words and felt something shift inside her. For 9 years, she had been a widow, a retiree, a woman who checked out library books and planted tomatoes and waited for her children to call. Now she was something else. Now she was a witness. The first call came at 7:15. An unknown number. She answered anyway. Ms. Thornton. This is David Webb from Channel 7 News. I'm hoping to get a comment on the article published this morning about the Holcomb family. Margaret took a breath. I have no additional comment at this time. She hung up. The phone rang again immediately. Different number. Same request. She turned the phone off. By 9 o'clock, there were news vans on the street outside the building. Margaret watched them from the 6th floor window. Reporters with microphones, cameramen adjusting their equipment, producers talking on cell phones, gesturing toward the Harwick Arms like it was a crime scene. In a way, she supposed it was. Ruthie appeared in the doorway. There are people outside, she said. Lots of them. I know. They want to talk to you. I know. Margaret turned from the window. Are you scared? Ruthie's chin lifted. Should I be? Margaret looked at this girl who had built something out of nothing, who had hidden from a bad situation and created a good one, who had flour on her hands and defiance in her eyes. No, she said, you shouldn't be. The phone calls kept coming. Reporters, lawyers, city officials, someone who claimed to be from the state attorney general's office but whose number didn't match any official listing. Margaret ignored them all. She was waiting. She knew Garrett Holcomb wouldn't let this stand. He wouldn't hide behind lawyers and spokespeople. He was too proud for that, too certain of his own power. He would come himself. She just had to wait. He arrived at 2 in the afternoon. No entourage this time. No lawyers. No silent men in expensive suits. Just Garrett Holcomb alone standing on the sidewalk outside the Harwick Arms. The news cameras swiveled toward him. Reporters shouted questions. He ignored them all, walking past them like they were furniture. Margaret met him at the door. Mr. Holcomb, Ms. Thornton. They stood facing each other. Two people who understood that this moment had been building for 50 years. "You've made a serious mistake," he said. His voice was calm, controlled. But she could see the cracks now. The tightness around his eyes. The way his hands weren't quite steady. "Have I?" "The article is full of inaccuracies. My lawyers will have it retracted by the end of the week." Margaret almost smiled. "I don't think they will. You don't know what you're dealing with." "Yes, I do." She stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind her. "I'm dealing with a man whose father covered up the disappearance of a young woman 50 years ago. I'm dealing with a family that has built its fortune on corruption and intimidation. I'm dealing with someone who thought he could make me disappear the same way his father made Dorothy disappear." She met his eyes. "But I'm still here." Holcomb's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. The confidence that had carried him through decades of success was crumbling. "What do you want?" he asked. The question surprised her. "What do I want? Everyone wants something. Money. Power. Recognition. Name your price." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Dorothy, 23 years old, who had wanted nothing but the truth. She thought about Vera, who had spent 50 years trying to find justice for her daughter. She thought about Clyde, who had kept a promise through 5 decades of silence. She thought about Ruthie and the Kowalskis and Eugene and all the people who had found shelter in this building, because one old woman had decided that some things mattered more than profit. "I want you to tell the truth," she said. Holcomb blinked. "What I want you to tell the truth about what your father did. I want you to acknowledge what happened to Dorothy Thornton. I want you to stop trying to bury the past." She paused. "That's what I want. You're asking me to destroy my family's legacy. I'm asking you to free it." Holcomb stared at her. "You're insane." "Maybe." Margaret shrugged. "Or maybe I'm just old enough to know that lies don't protect you. They just make you smaller. Until one day you wake up and realize you've disappeared." She turned back toward the door. "You can fight this," she said over her shoulder. "You can hire lawyers and issue denials and try to bury the story. But it won't work. The truth is out now. And truth has a way of surviving." She opened the door. "I'll be inside if you change your mind." She went in and closed the door behind her. She didn't expect him to follow. She expected lawyers, injunctions, legal threats, and corporate intimidation. What she got was silence. For 3 days, Garrett Holcomb said nothing. No public statements, no legal filings, no threatening letters or mysterious inspectors. Just silence. The news cycle moved on to other stories. The reporters packed up their vans and drove away. The phone calls slowed to a trickle. But Margaret knew better than to think it was over. Men like Holcomb didn't give up. They regrouped. They strategized. They found new angles of attack. She just had to be ready. On Sunday morning, a car pulled up outside the building. Not a news van. Not a police car. Just a simple sedan, dark blue, unremarkable. Garrett Holcomb got out. He was alone again. But something was different about him. The arrogance that had defined him was gone. In its place was something she didn't immediately recognize. He stood on the sidewalk looking up at the building. Then he walked to the door and knocked. Margaret met him in the lobby. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there looking around at the worn linoleum and the cloudy mailboxes and the stairs that led up to the lives he had tried to displace. "My father died in 2008, he said, finally. Heart attack. Quick." Margaret waited. "He never told me what really happened in 75. He said the Thornton girl ran off with some boyfriend. Said it was an embarrassment to the family. Said we shouldn't talk about it." Holcomb's voice was flat, empty. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He was my father. He was a detective. He was supposed to be one of the good guys. He looked at Margaret. "I spent 3 days going through his old files. The ones he kept in storage. The ones he told me were just old case notes." He paused. "He kept everything. Every document, every report, every lie he told." Margaret didn't speak. He knew what happened to her. Holcomb's voice cracked slightly. He knew, and he covered it up because someone paid him to. "Who, I don't know yet. The records are incomplete. But I'm going to find out." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. "This is everything I've found so far. Names, dates, transactions. Some of it confirms what your journalist published. Some of it goes further." He held out the folder. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. My family built everything we have on a lie, and I benefited from that lie, even when I didn't know what it was." Margaret took the folder. "But I'm done protecting it." He met her eyes. "You were right. The truth is out. And I'm not going to spend the rest of my life trying to bury it." He turned toward the door. "What are you going to do?" Margaret asked. Holcomb stopped. "I'm going to tell the truth. To the journalists. To the investigators. To anyone who asks." He didn't look back. "I'm going to finish what Dorothy Thornton started." Margaret stood in the lobby for a long time after he left. She held the folder in her hands and felt the weight of it. More evidence. More names. More pieces of a puzzle that had taken 50 years to assemble. But that wasn't what she was thinking about. She was thinking about change. About how people could surprise you. About how guilt could transform into something else. About how the truth once spoken could open doors that had been locked for generations. She didn't trust Garrett Holcomb. She wasn't naive enough for that. But she believed him. And maybe that was enough. The following weeks unfolded like a story that had waited half a century to be told. Garrett Holcomb went public. He gave interviews. He turned over his father's files to investigators. He stood in front of cameras and admitted that his family's fortune was built on corruption and cover-ups. The city council opened a formal inquiry. 3 other property owners in Harwick came forward with similar experiences. Intimidation, fraud, forced sales. The state attorney general launched an investigation, and Dorothy Thornton's name finally was spoken aloud. Margaret spent most of those weeks in the building. She wasn't sure when it had started to feel like home. Not the legal definition, the paperwork and the deed and the property taxes. The other kind. The kind that had to do with belonging. She had breakfast with Ruthie most mornings now. The girl was working on her business plan, filling out applications for grants and licenses, dreaming about a real bakery with her name on the door. She had lunch with the Kowalskis. The children had started calling her Aunt Maggie, which made her cry the first time she heard it. She sat with Clyde in the evenings, listening to records, watching the city lights come on. And she watched him play. It wasn't every day. Sometimes he would sit at the piano and put his hands on the keys, and nothing would come. He would stay there for an hour, waiting, and then he would get up and go back to his chair by the window. But other days, the music would flow. Not complete songs, not yet. Just fragments, phrases, melodies that seemed to be searching for each other across 50 years of silence. He was finding his way back. They all were. The contractor's report came back in the 4th week. Margaret had hired someone to assess the building properly, a real inspector recommended by Hank, who knew the difference between structural problems and structural character. The bones are good, the inspector said. He was a practical man with practical hands, the kind of person who told you the truth whether you wanted to hear it or not. The roof needs attention. 2 units need new plumbing. The elevator's not worth restoring. He paused. But the building is sound. It wants to stand. Margaret liked that phrase. It wants to stand. She felt the same way. She called Thomas Hartley, the lawyer who had first contacted her about the inheritance. "I won't be accepting any offers for the property," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Are you sure, given everything that's happened, you might want to consider, I'm sure?" She could hear him nodding through the phone. "What will you do with it? I'm gonna keep it. Fix what needs fixing. Let the people who live here stay." She paused. "And I'm gonna stay too." The paperwork took weeks. Formalizing the arrangements with the Kowalskis. Finding a lawyer to help Ruthie with her business license. Working with Eugene to donate his documents to a university archive, giving them legal standing and historical preservation. Margaret had never been so busy in her life. Some days she was exhausted by noon, her body reminding her that 71 was not 41, that she couldn't run on coffee and determination forever. But she kept going, because for the first time in 9 years, she had a reason to get out of bed. Clyde Ashford played a complete song on the first Saturday in May. Margaret was in her apartment when she heard it. Not fragments this time, not searching phrases. A melody, a rhythm, a story told in notes instead of words. She climbed the stairs to the 4th floor and stood in the doorway listening. He played with his eyes closed, his fingers moving across the keys like they remembered something his mind had forgotten. The song was slow and sad and beautiful, the kind of music that made you think about everyone you had ever lost. When he finished, he opened his eyes and saw her standing there. "That was for Dorothy," he said. Margaret nodded. She would have loved it. Clyde almost smiled. "I know." She called her daughter Catherine that evening. 40 minutes on the phone just like before, but different now. She had things to tell, stories to share, plans to make. "Mom," Catherine said, finally, "you sound different." "Do I?" "You sound like yourself again." Margaret thought about that. "I feel like myself again." There was a pause. "I'm coming to visit," Catherine said. "Next month. I want to see this building you keep talking about." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. "I'd like that." The building was changing, not physically. The walls were still the same worn plaster. The floors still creaked in the same familiar places. The mailboxes still wore their cloudy brass faces. But something had shifted in the air. The Kowalski children played in the hallways now, their laughter echoing up the stairwell. Ruthie's bread filled the building with warmth every morning. Eugene had started organizing his documents instead of just accumulating them, creating an archive that would outlast them all. And Clyde played every day. Not all day. Not even most of the day. But every day at some point the sound of the piano would drift down from the fourth floor. Sometimes Margaret could hear him from her apartment. Other times she would climb the stairs and sit in the chair by his window and listen. He was writing new music now. Songs that came from wherever songs come from. He said he had 50 years of silence stored up inside him. And now it was all trying to come out at once. Margaret understood. She had her own silence to release. The investigation concluded in late June. Warren Holcomb was named as a person of interest in the 1975 disappearance of Dorothy Thornton. Since he was dead, no charges could be filed. But the official record was amended. Dorothy Thornton had not run away. Dorothy Thornton had been silenced because she had tried to tell the truth. Margaret received a letter from the city council acknowledging the historical injustice and expressing regret for the delayed recognition. It wasn't enough. Nothing could be enough. But it was something. She was sitting in Vera's apartment reading the letter again when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Ruthie appeared in the doorway. "There's someone here to see you." "Who?" "She says she's Dorothy's friend. From back then." Margaret's heart stopped. "Send her up." The woman's name was Patricia. She was 75 years old, white-haired and frail, but her eyes were sharp. "I read the article," she said, "back in April. I've been trying to decide whether to come ever since." She sat down across from Margaret. "Dorothy and I were friends. We worked together at Mercer and Associates. She told me what she'd found. She asked me to help her." Patricia's voice trembled. "I was too scared. I told her to let it go. I told her it wasn't worth the risk." She looked down at her hands. "The last time I saw her, she told me she was going to the newspaper the next morning. She asked me to come with her. I said no." Tears were running down her face now. "I've spent 50 years wondering if she'd still be alive if I'd said yes." Margaret reached out and took the old woman's hands. "You couldn't have known. I knew enough to be scared. That meant I knew enough to help." Patricia looked up. "I came because I needed to tell someone. I needed to say it out loud after all these years." She squeezed Margaret's hands. "You did what I couldn't do. You finished what we started. and I needed you to know that it matters." Margaret thought about that conversation for a long time afterward, about guilt, about courage, about the choices we make and the ones we don't. Patricia had spent 50 years carrying the weight of a decision made in fear. She had survived, but she had never been free. Dorothy had made a different choice. She had been brave, and she had paid for it. Neither path was simple. Neither outcome was clean. But the truth, once spoken, had finally set them both free. Summer turned to fall. The building settled into its new rhythms. Ruthie's Bakery expanded to supply 2 local restaurants. The Kowalski children started school in September. Legitimate students with legitimate paperwork that had finally been sorted out. Eugene published an article in a historical journal documenting the corruption patterns he had spent years uncovering. It wasn't front-page news, but it was part of the record now. Permanent. Undeniable. Clyde finished his album in October. He recorded it in the living room of his apartment with a microphone borrowed from a local studio and an engineer who had been a fan of his music 50 years ago. The album was called The Waiting, and it was the most beautiful thing Margaret had ever heard. She listened to it alone in her apartment the first time, tears streaming down her face. Every note carried the weight of silence, and every note broke through it. Catherine visited in November. She stood in the lobby of the Harwick Arms and looked around at the worn floors and the cloudy mailboxes and the stairs that led up to lives she had never known existed. "It's not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect? I don't know. Something bigger. More impressive." Margaret smiled. "It's not about the building. It's about what's inside." She took her daughter's hand. "Come on, I want you to meet everyone." They had dinner with the Kowalskis that night. Jolene cooked. Hank told stories about fixing the boiler. The children showed Catherine their drawings and their school projects and the secret fort they had built in the back of the supply closet. Ruthie brought dessert. A cake she had been working on for a week layered with the same honey and apple butter that had won Margaret over on that first day. Clyde came down from the 4th floor, which he rarely did, and sat at the table with everyone else. He didn't speak much, but he was there. That was enough. After dinner, Margaret and Catherine sat on the front steps of the building. The air was cold, but neither of them wanted to go inside yet. "You've changed," Catherine said. "Have I?" "You're not small anymore." Margaret thought about that. "I was small for a long time," she said. "After your father died, I made myself small because I thought that was how you survived." She looked up at the building behind her. "But I was wrong. Survival isn't about getting smaller. It's about standing tall, even when it's hard, even when you're scared." Catherine leaned against her mother's shoulder. "Dad would be proud of you." "I know." Margaret felt tears in her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. "I just wish he could see it." The winter was hard. The boiler broke twice. The roof leaked in 3 places. A pipe burst in Eugene's apartment and flooded half of his documents. But they survived. Hank fixed the boiler both times, cursing in Polish and English and occasionally in languages Margaret didn't recognize. Ruthie organized volunteers to patch the roof. Eugene spent a week drying out his papers page by page, preserving what could be preserved. Margaret paid for the repairs. It took most of her savings, the money she had been setting aside for the reasonable, quiet, practical future she had imagined when she first drove to Harwick. But she didn't regret it. This was better than reasonable. This was real. Spring came slowly. Margaret was in her apartment watching the first green shoots appear in the window boxes Jolene had installed when she heard the music. Not the piano. Something different. She climbed the stairs to the 4th floor. Clyde was sitting in his usual chair by the window, but he wasn't alone. Ruthie was there holding a violin she had borrowed from somewhere. Hank was there with a guitar he hadn't played in years. Even Eugene was there, tapping on an overturned bucket like it was a drum. They were playing together, badly, laughing at their mistakes, trying again. Clyde saw Margaret in the doorway and smiled. "Come in," he said. "We need someone to listen." So Margaret sat down in the chair by the window and listened. The music was imperfect, unrehearsed, joyful in a way that only unrehearsed music can be. And somehow it was perfect. On the anniversary of Dorothy Thornton's disappearance, they held a memorial. Nothing fancy. Just a gathering in the lobby of the Harwick Arms. Everyone who lived in the building, plus Patricia, plus Brenda Callahan, plus a few neighbors who had heard about what had happened and wanted to pay their respects. Margaret read Dorothy's letter aloud. "Please do not let my story end here. Please do not let them win. Finish what I started." When she finished, there was a moment of silence. Then Clyde sat down at the piano. He played the song he had written for Dorothy, the one he had performed for the first time a month ago, the one that carried 50 years of silence and finally broke through. When he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Margaret stood at the window of her apartment that night and looked out at the city. 1 year ago, she had driven to Harwick expecting to sign papers and go home. 1 year ago, she had been small, invisible. A woman waiting for something without knowing what she was waiting for. Now she was something else. She was a property owner, a witness, a friend, a neighbor, an aunt. She was someone who had stood up when standing up was hard. She was someone who had finished what needed to be finished. The building rose around her 6 floors of lives intertwined. Ruthie on the 2nd floor planning her bakery, dreaming of a future she was building with her own hands. The Kowalskis on the 3rd, their children growing their family safe in a place that had become home. Clyde on the 4th, playing every day now, filling the building with music that had waited 50 years to be heard. Eugene on the 5th, surrounded by his documents, preserving the truth for generations that hadn't been born yet. And Margaret on the 6th in Vera's old apartment, carrying the legacy of a woman she had barely known and a cousin she had never met. She thought about Dorothy, about what it meant to do the right thing, no matter what it cost, about what it meant to stand up even when you were afraid, about what it meant to finish something that someone else had started, knowing that someone else would continue it when you were gone. She was 71 years old. She had driven 4 hours to sign papers and go home. Instead, she had found a family, a purpose, a home. And from somewhere below her, from the 4th floor where Clyde sat at his piano, music rose into the night. A melody found, held, becoming slowly a song. The building stood tall around her, warm and solid and full of life, and Margaret stood with it,